Tears of the Kingdom has not only been my most anticipated game of the past couple of years, it's been the only game I've been excited for since The Last of Us Part 2 back in 2020. Well, thank goodness there's a new Professor Layton for me to look forward to now I've played this. Breath of the Wild is one of my favourite games of all time. I actually replayed it in anticipation of this a couple months ago, and it feels just as momentous as it did back in 2017. The announcement of a direct sequel in 2019 came as a very pleasant surprise, although it is funny to think then I thought we'd be getting it within a year or two a la Majora's Mask, when in actuality, the gap between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom's release was as long as the one between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild. Granted, COVID undeniably played a part in the delay. I do think we would have gotten this long before now without it, but the closer to release we got, the more it also seemed like Nintendo were really pulling out all the stops to ensure this wasn't just glorified DLC. And regardless of whether it is or isn't, I've been very excited to discuss this one, so without further delay, let's dive in. I'll start by saying the opening for this game is brilliant. Link and Zelda are descending deep beneath Hyrule Castle on the trail of the source of a mysterious gloom, discovering a mural depicting the earliest history of Hyrule and its first Great War along the way. Intriguing enough, but the music elevates this sequence to a whole other level by instilling this enthralling sense of dread in the player not shared by the characters. Zelda's excitement at these ruins creates a fascinating contrast to the score warning us what awaits within these caverns is horribly sinister, and the way it builds the deeper down you go gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. Of course, I knew exactly what they were going to discover thanks to the E3 reveal, but finally seeing this creepy corpse in action, annihilating Link's health, arm, and the Master's Sword before causing a great upheaval to Hyrule just as Link and Zelda separately teleport away. Oh man, what a way to kick off a sequel! I was instantly hooked, and the following moments of Link reawakening on what is quickly revealed to be one of the newly formed Sky Islands feel equally exhilarating and intriguing. There you meet the spirit of Rauru, Hyrule's first king, who kindly lends Link use of his right arm after it got knackered in the prologue.
I live on through this arm!
It's after his introduction I realized this island would serve as the Great Plateau 2.0, the tutorial area where 4 shrines must be beaten to unlock new abilities and continue with the story. And to be honest, I found this stretch rather tedious to play through. Granted, I don't think replaying Breath of the Wild a month in advance exactly helped, but having it preceded by such an amazing story-driven intro left me agitated when this lengthy tutorial slammed the narrative momentum to a grinding halt. I think this whole bit should have been streamlined considerably, so it's still there for newcomers, but not so disruptive to plot progression for those familiar with many of the mechanics being taught. Anyway, once you're done with that area, you plummet back down to Hyrule to discover Zelda's whereabouts are a total mystery, and the upheaval has caused all sorts of chaos across the land. Now, something I was very curious about going in was what the storytelling structure would look like. Breath of the Wild broke its narrative progression up between searching for memories and dealing with the 4 divine beasts, so I wondered if Nintendo would attempt to expand upon this formula or take a more streamlined approach this go around. And it's more or less the exact same as its predecessor. Okay, there aren't any divine beasts in this game, but you go to the same 4 locations which each have their own little storyline, same basic gist. This time, Link is requested by Pura to investigate and promptly deal with situations arisen in each of those regions because of the upheaval. It doesn't feel as naturally woven into the primary narrative as Breath of the Wild's 4-part questline did, and there are these sage characters introduced briefly who are noticeably nothing more than a pointless copy and paste of the champion's role in the last game. They're very forgettable, I don't believe you ever learn any names, and where these missions can be beaten in any order, the exact same information about the First Great War is repeated to you 4 times. Ugh, it's annoying and makes things feel pretty repetitive at times, but hey, on the upside, the rest of the characters burst with personality just as before, and overall, I found the Rito and Zora subplots to be a total joy. The Goron and Gerudo ones are decent as well, but the upheaval's impact isn't felt as much in those areas compared to Rito Village and Zora's Domain, where it's very interesting to see how the respective races are dealing with these radical circumstances. I loved being accompanied by archery prodigy Tulin and of course Sidon, who has a nice arc about re-embracing his optimistic attitude amid these current hardships. While I won't pretend the gameplay doesn't make up a lot of my enjoyment for this side of the story, it is hard not to be utterly charmed by the exuberant designs and fun dialogue these characters possess. As for the memory finding side of things, the Tears of the Kingdom subtitle refers to specific markings found on these mysterious geoglyphs which appeared after the upheaval. By finding the dragon tears hidden within the patterns, you discover Zelda was taken back in time to Hyrule's founding era after the opening, where she joined forces with Rauru and partook in the fight against Ganondorf. In Breath of the Wild, you already knew what the outcome of the flashbacks would be, whereas here there's a real sense of intrigue as to what happens to Zelda, and it's rather compelling to piece the events together with each new memory you discover. By the time I'd nearly found them all, I was practically racing across the map looking for the last few to see how it would all culminate. And while I clocked on exactly what would occur, it's no less shocking to see it actually happen, cementing this iteration of Zelda as one of the more tragic in the series when you consider her ordeals in both games. Nintendo clearly strived to tell a richer tale in this follow-up. Cutscenes get lengthier, voice acting is more consistently good, and there are several hours of story content only directly revealed to the player after completing the Dragon's Tears and Regional Phenomena missions, allowing enough time and focus in the back half to properly build up a grand conclusion. In spite of the game's open structure, this story moves like a real page-turner in its most engrossing moments, of which there are many. Although this is the third direct sequel in the Zelda series to reuse a previous entry's engine, I think it's the first to take place in the same setting, although there have been some major changes made to this Hyrule. Most obvious are the new layers added to the map. As a great lover of Skyward Sword, it's very cool to be exploring the sky again. Aesthetically, it's very pretty, giving the gliding an extra grandeur thanks to the spectacular view below, and the Ghibli-esque music which plays here is gorgeously atmospheric. Actually, I've got to take a quick detour to say the whole soundtrack is outstanding, easily the biggest upgrade from Breath of the Wild. The minimalist approach to music in that game works very well, don't get me wrong, but the added gusto to the orchestrations here and how certain tracks contribute to an already brilliant sense of build-up in key scenarios consistently blew me away. There's so many amazing tracks I can't stop listening to right now. Anyway, getting back on track, I don't think this takes the concept of a world in the sky much further from what Skyward Sword was doing, and perhaps I'm just craving another idyllic, homey area like Skyloft, but there aren't many distinct locations aside from the temples to explore outside of the story. However, the sections where you have to ascend up these platforms to reach some of these temples are an absolute blast, among my favourite parts in the whole game. This is where it expands upon Skyward Sword in a terrifically creative way, with fantastic large-scale long-distance platforming and insanely fun gimmicks to utilize as you make your way higher and higher into the clouds. In a complete contrast to that, there are open chasms to be dived down which reveal a whole underground layer of the map shrouded in darkness. These are called the depths, and while I don't have tons to say about it, the depths have a nice eerie vibe with all sorts of threats to deal with, and I like how the way can be lit with these bright bloom seeds or light roots, which serve the same role as towers do on the surface. And speaking of the surface, despite these new and exciting areas, most of my playtime still wound up being spent where I've already spent hundreds of hours playing in. Naturally, there are always concerns of a reused open world, making the game feel a bit been there, done that. But there are more than enough subtle and major tweaks made to the layout and placement of the towers and stables to make the map feel not too familiar. Simple things like Central Hyrule no longer being an enemy hotspot changes the dynamic of exploration majorly. And there are tons of these caves to discover with rare enemies to fight and useful items to find. It's as much a treat to re-explore this altered world as the first time in Breath of the Wild was, and there's these great parts where you're presented with a riddle and the environment must be searched in order to solve it. It works so well with the open world nature of the game, especially in Zora's Domain, where one objective branches off into several, each aiding in completing another and offering a variety of tasks to complete. I will admit the lack of Revali's Gale does downgrade the traversal at times. With all the sky stuff, I get why it was removed and replaced with a gust of wind that pushes you forwards, but it was really helpful for scaling mountains and preserving stamina while doing so. To be honest, all the new powers unlocked after each part of the regional phenomena quest aren't as good as the ones in Breath of the Wild. I only cared to use them during boss fights for the extra attack power. The game also omits the old rune abilities by replacing the Sheikah Slate with a downgraded version for no apparent reason, just so Raru's arm can play host to new ones. The first one unlocked is Ultra Hand, which is basically magnesis, but you can stick objects together to create all manner of useful things. A lot of people love using this to make all sorts of crazy stuff, and it was very much advertised as such. But I've never been the type of person who enjoys creating things in games. Put it to you this way, I had a lot of fun using the pre-made vehicles whenever they'd show up, but I'm never interested in the effort of making one myself. This in itself is not a problem, although the need for assembling bits and pieces in a stretch near the end bored me silly. But there is a vast scope to this ability which leads to a certain way of thinking for puzzles that I never got used to. For instance, when I see turning wheels with a space between two of them, my instinct is to find an extra wheel. I don't think to shoot two icicles off the ceiling to clunkily connect the two wheels together. I mostly enjoyed Ultra Hand whenever its usage came about organically, but it did cause me some nuisance. Luckily, I feel more positively about the rest of the new abilities. Ascend is a bit situational, albeit nifty, I think its use is fairly self-explanatory, but then there's Fuse, arguably the most useful one with its capacity to combine items with weapons or arrows to make them significantly stronger or even useful for non-combat scenarios. It's very satisfying to see a measly sword double or even triple in strength, and quick piece of advice to any newcomers, save the Gibdo bones for the final boss and thank me later. My absolute favourite of the new abilities, however, is Recall, which sends an object back in time through its last movements. There are some ingenious uses of it in the revamped shrines and dungeons, and I always loved using it. By the way, on that note, it's kind of funny how a lot of people rejoiced at the return of classic dungeons when the change was purely cosmetic, as the progression is exactly the same as in the Divine Beasts. I did have to use a guide a lot more than expected for reasons earlier discussed, but I also got plenty of satisfaction out of these too, with always inventive level design, situations, and solutions. They also feature some great boss fights, one a riveting spectacle and the others with enjoyable quirks to exploit. Now, of course, the ones I didn't get footage of were capable of delivering one-hit kills even with a hefty heart count, which got irritating in the moment, but finally mastering them revealed a great adrenaline rush. But when random enemies would obliterate Link's health in one fell swoop, that felt excessive. This whole experience was a myriad of highs and lows for me. I'd get fed up with it at times, whilst others, many in fact, left me thinking, oh god, I love this. Parts of this simply didn't appeal to me, so despite plenty of much appreciated quality of life improvements and other wonderful upgrades, I realized long before hitting the credits I prefer Breath of the Wild. Still though, the highs of Tears of the Kingdom are phenomenally high, and overall I have no qualms about calling this a great sequel and a great game in general. I know I'm far from done with it as well. It wasn't until I finished the story I even thought about revisiting somewhere like the Great Plateau. So many hours of delving further into this wonderful, varied world, and all the side quests and new side adventures surely await me, and boy do I look forward to it.